welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here for this.
So take a second and just look at the Bible you might have sitting on your desk right now.
Or the app on your phone, you know?
Yeah, exactly. The app on your phone. You have this finalized, pristine, hyper-accessible text right in front of you.
Right.
You can just pull up any verse in half a second. But how did it actually get there?
It is a massive question.
It really is. How did this specific collection of words survive thousands of years of manual copying, vicious imperial persecution, and just plain, ordinary human error?
Yeah.
So today, our mission in this deep dive is to answer that question. We are going to examine the transmission, the corruption, and the pristine restoration of the New Testament text.
We really are.
We are going to look at the intersection of divine inspiration and, well, fragile human hands, specifically focusing on the theological frameworks provided in Matthew chapter 5 and 2 Timothy chapter 3.
Sounds good.
Okay, so to set the stage for all this, think about it this way. Imagine someone sits down and plays a flawless piece of music on a piano.
Okay.
But a few of the keys on that specific piano are broken.
Right, yeah.
The original composition, the music as it was written in the mind of the composer, remains flawless, even if the transmission in that moment, in that physical room, has some audible flaws.
That makes total sense.
So today, we're looking at how to read the original sheet music despite the broken keys of history.
I really love that analogy. It captures the tension we're dealing with beautifully.
Thanks.
Because we're looking at a flawless original composition entrusted to an imperfect instrument. The history of the New Testament text is the history of an absolute treasure entrusted to earthen vessels.
What is the vessels, right?
Yeah, the apostolic writings came from men carried along by the Holy Spirit, but their subsequent copies were made by ordinary believers.
Just normal people.
Exactly. These were people whose eyes grew tired in dim light, whose hearing could fail in a crowded room, whose memories could wander, and, whose theological judgments could sometimes be mistaken. Because we have this conjunction of divine inspiration on one hand and human transmission on the other, we really need to make some very careful distinctions right at the start.
Let's lay out those definitions, because if we don't, it is incredibly easy to get lost in the weeds when we start throwing around historical terms later on.
Yeah, we definitely need to define 3 specific terms here: inspiration, preservation, and textual criticism.
Okay, let's start with inspiration.
So inspiration properly belongs to the prophetic and apostolic text as originally given. It applies to those original autographs.
Meaning the physical piece of parchment the Apostle Paul or John actually signed.
Yes, that original physical document. Then preservation describes God's providential care.
Right.
It is the guarantee by which that word has not vanished from the church over the centuries, despite all the chaos of history.
Okay. And the third term.
And then we have textual criticism. That is the disciplined scientific comparison of surviving witnesses.
By witnesses, you mean the manuscript copies.
Yeah, the thousands of manuscript copies we have, we compare them in order to identify the earliest recoverable wording.
Okay, that makes sense.
So when we use the word corruption in this highly technical setting, we're talking about the introduction of textual variation.
Like typos.
Just typos, yes. We are not talking about the destruction of Christian doctrine or the defeat of divine providence.
Right.
This lines up perfectly with the Westminster Confession of Faith, Chapter 1, Section 8, which states that the original texts were kept pure in all ages.
Okay, I have to push back here for a second.
Go ahead.
Because I know what the person sitting in the pew feels when they hear this. When the average Christian hears the word corruption applied to biblical manuscripts, panic sets in.
Oh, absolutely.
They assume the core Christian doctrines are compromised. It conjures up these cinematic images of malicious monks in a castle somewhere, huddled around a candle, rewriting the Bible to invent a new religion or hide the truth.
Like a huge conspiracy.
Right, like a massive plot. So, if kept pure is the standard, how do we redefine corruption in this technical setting so it doesn't cause that kind of existential terror?
Well, we redefine it by looking at what kept pure actually means, historically and theologically.
Okay.
God did not keep his word pure by removing all human weakness from the equation. He didn't, create one magical, flawless manuscript that floated down from heaven and remained locked in an impenetrable vault, completely untouched by human hands.
That would be nice, but yeah, that didn't happen.
No, it didn't. What he did was prevent that human weakness from extinguishing or fundamentally obscuring the apostolic deposit.
Got it.
Corruption just means a scribe skipped a line because his eyes were tired after working for 12 hours.
Right, human fatigue.
Exactly. It means someone misspelled a word because they had bad hearing. It does not mean the Trinity was added 3 centuries later or the resurrection was fabricated by a council.
Where the core dogmas remain untouched.
Yes. The preservation of the text was accomplished through a genuinely human history marked by numerous minor variants.
Okay.
Yet the original text has been preserved with such massive breadth and such overwhelming redundancy that responsible textual criticism can identify the original wording with substantial confidence.
That distinction completely shifts the perspective.
It really does.
We are talking about human exhaustion, not a grand, sinister conspiracy to erase the truth.
Exactly.
And since human weakness is the main culprit here, we should look at the actual environment where these humans operated. The reality of how these texts were first copied was, well, frankly, chaotic.
Incredibly chaotic. To understand the New Testament transmission, you really have to contrast it with the Old Testament transmission.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Under the Mosaic economy, the transcription of the Hebrew scrolls was governed by an intensely rigorous methodology.
Right.
The scribes, known as the Sopharim, and later the Masoretes, operated under strict, centralized institutional conditions. They had elaborate, unbending rules.
Very structured.
Extremely. They counted every single character, every word, every line on the parchment to prevent any insertion or dilution.
Wow, every single character.
Yes. And if a mistake was found, the scroll was often buried or destroyed. They had comfortable, authorized settings to do this work.
A proper office environment for the ancient world.
Basically, yeah. They viewed the physical words on the parchment as the literal breath of God, and they had the state-sponsored institutional support to guarantee structural perfection in their copying.
Right, but the early Christians didn't have state-sponsored scriptoria.
No, they didn't.
They didn't have comfortable desks and government funding. They were public enemies.
That is the crucial difference here. The New Testament believers were operating under severe Roman persecution.
Right.
From the writing of the apostolic autographs all the way until the legalization of Christianity in the 4th century, copying the epistles and gospels was a dangerous, subversive act.
Very risky.
Believers copied these texts in haste, often in private homes, in cellars, or just hidden locations. They lived under the constant threat of having their property confiscated, or, worse, facing execution.
Yeah, literal life and death situations.
Especially during the Diocletianic persecution, Roman authorities enacted edicts that specifically targeted Christian books for systematic destruction. The Roman authorities weren't stupid.
No, they knew what they were doing.
They knew that to destroy the movement, they needed to burn the books.
So the people copying the Gospel of John or the letters of Paul during this time were not professional, highly trained calligraphers.
Not at all.
They were just ordinary believers. They were merchants, slaves, and tradesmen who loved the gospel and knew they had to make a backup copy before the Roman soldiers kicked the door down.
That is exactly right. They lacked formal calligraphic training. But this hostile environment forced the text to scatter rapidly. It spread across the Mediterranean into Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Rome. Because these Christians were geographically isolated from one another, these texts developed localized characteristics.
Like different families of texts.
Yes. Modern scholars categorize these as distinct text types, such as the Alexandrian stream in Egypt, the Western stream in Rome, and the Byzantine stream in the East.
Here is where it gets really fascinating. The geographical scattering feels like a disaster at first glance.
It does.
But it's actually a massive providential safeguard.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there was no single centralized publishing house. No single heretic, rogue emperor, or misguided scribe could corrupt the entire manuscript stream.
Right.
The very persecution designed to destroy the text forced a decentralized backup system that saved it.
It is a striking display of divine providence.
It really is.
If a scribe in Rome made a massive error, or even tried to intentionally change a verse to support a local heresy, that change would only affect the copies made from his specific manuscript in that specific region.
Because there was no internet to spread the error.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the believers down in Egypt and over in Syria were copying from entirely different source documents.
Right.
The geographic dispersal acted as a quarantine. When Constantine finally legalized the faith and manuscript production transitioned into professional scriptoria, the church was left with a vast, decentralized web of evidence.
A huge network of manuscripts.
Yes. The raw material of preservation was scattered across centuries and continents, just waiting to be brought back together for comparison.
All right, so we know the environment was chaotic, the scribes were often amateurs, and they were working in terrible conditions.
Yes.
What specific mistakes did these exhausted scribes actually make? Scholars like Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman have compiled massive catalogs of these variants.
They have.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of human error.
Sure. So Metzger and Ehrman compared the textual critic to a physician who must diagnose an injury before prescribing its cure.
I like that.
Their catalog of scribal errors breaks down what physically happened during the copying process. First, we have to look at the visual errors, the errors of the eye.
Okay.
Ancient Greek was written in something called scriptio continua. This means there were no spaces between the words, no punctuation marks, no commas, no periods, and no lowercase letters.
Wow.
It was just a massive continuous block of capital letters.
I always tell people to try reading a full paragraph in English, written in all caps with no spaces. The red fox jumping over the hand, it makes your brain hurt.
It really does.
Now imagine doing that for an entire book by candlelight after working a manual labor job all day.
And remember, they didn't have prescription glasses.
Right, good point.
If you had astigmatism or just failing eyesight from age, you were in serious trouble. Scribes easily confused letters that looked similar.
Like which ones?
Well, in the Greek majuscule script, the moon-shaped lunar sigma, the epsilon, the theta, and the omicron are very easy to mix up if the ink is faded or the light is bad.
Oh yeah, they all look like little circles.
Exactly. Metzger and Ehrman point out a brilliant example of this in Romans chapter 12, verse 11.
What happens there?
The original text says believers should be serving the Lord. The Greek word for Lord, kurios, was frequently contracted by scribes into a shorthand abbreviation called a nomen sacrum.
Just a time saver.
Right, just a kappa and an omega with a line drawn over it. But some scribes misread that abbreviation.
How so?
They saw the kappa, perhaps with a heavy dot of ink next to it, and confused it with the abbreviation for the word time, kairos.
Oh.
As a result, a textual variant was created that reads, serving the time, instead of serving the Lord.
That is a completely understandable human mistake. Your eye just slips, or a smudge of ink changes a letter.
Very understandable.
What about the mistakes where they skip whole lines? I know there's a technical term for that phenomenon.
The technical terms are parablepsis, which means looking by the side, and homoeoteleuton, which means a similar ending of lines.
Parablepsis and homoeoteleuton.
Yes. This happens when a scribe's eye skips from one line to another line that ends with the exact same word.
Okay, give us an example.
For example, in Codex Vaticanus, one of our most famous manuscripts, the scribe is copying John chapter 17, verse 15. He completely omitted a massive phrase.
Just left it out.
Yeah, he skipped the words world, but that you keep them from the one.
Why did he do that?
Because the line he was copying and the lines several lines further down the page both ended with the Greek words for world and evil one.
Oh, I see.
His eye drifted to the second instance of the phrase, and he just kept writing, entirely missing the chunk of text in between.
Anyone who has ever typed from a physical document has done that.
Oh, definitely.
You look down at the paper, look up at your screen, look back at the paper, and you lose your place because two sentences end with the word and. You just skip a whole paragraph.
It is a universal human experience. Beyond those visual errors, we also have auditory errors, known as itacism.
Errors of the ear. This happens when someone is dictating the text aloud to a room full of scribes, right?
Yes. In scriptoria, one person would read the text aloud, and multiple scribes would write it down simultaneously to produce several copies at once.
Very efficient.
But in Koine Greek, as the language evolved, many different vowels and diphthongs lost their distinctive sounds and came to be pronounced identically.
Like homophone.
Yes, many of them ended up sounding like the long E in the English word feet. Because they sounded the same, a scribe listening to dictation would write down the wrong word based on what he heard.
Do you have a specific verse for that?
A classic example is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 54. The text is supposed to say, death is swallowed up in victory.
Right, famous verse.
But the Greek word for victory, nikos, sounded identical to the Greek word for conflict, nikos.
Oh, no.
So a scribe hears the reader say nikos, assumes he means conflict, and writes that down. Now we have early manuscripts that actually read, death is swallowed up in conflict.
That completely changes the tone of the verse. Swallowed up in conflict sounds like a grim tragedy, not a glorious triumph over death.
It does. Or look at Revelation chapter 4, verse 3. The text describes a beautiful rainbow around the throne of God.
Okay.
The Greek word for rainbow is iris, but it sounded identical to the word for priests, Hierus.
Oh, boy.
So, Codex Sinaiticus features the variant describing priests around the throne instead of a rainbow.
That is wild.
Now, these are unintentional errors of the ear and the eye. They are highly recognizable, and because we have thousands of other manuscripts from different regions, they are very easy to spot and correct.
So it is easy to forgive a tired scribe for skipping a line or mishearing a vowel. But what happens when a scribe is wide awake, reading the text, and decides he doesn't like what it says?
It is a whole different category.
That introduces a completely different threat to the manuscript.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the intentional changes, the errors of the mind.
Intentional changes usually arose from a scribe trying to be helpful, which makes them particularly tricky.
Trying to be helpful.
Yes. One major category is harmonization. A scribe copying the Gospel of Mark might come across a story that he had already memorized from hearing the Gospel of Matthew preached in church every week.
Okay.
If Mark's version was slightly shorter or used different phrasing, the scribe might naturally or deliberately add words to make Mark match Matthew. They wanted the accounts to sound identical.
They were smoothing out the rough edges so the Gospels didn't seem to contradict each other.
Exactly. And then you have pious falsification.
That sounds intense.
It sounds incredibly malicious, but it was usually an overzealous attempt to protect Christian doctrine from heretics.
How so?
Scribes felt immense theological pressure. For instance, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, Jesus is talking about his return, and he says, "But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only."
Right.
Some Orthodox scribes were deeply troubled by the phrase, "nor the Son," because it seemed to imply that Jesus lacked omniscience.
I can see that.
They knew heretics would use that verse to attack Christ's divinity. So to quote-unquote protect Jesus, they simply dropped the phrase, "nor the Son," from the text.
They were trying to defend God, but they ended up altering his word in the process. I know there is another famous example regarding the virgin birth in the Gospel of Luke.
Yes. In Luke chapter 2, the original text frequently refers to Joseph and Mary as Jesus' parents, or it refers to Joseph directly as his father.
Okay.
Some scribes altered these references to say Joseph and his mother to heavily guard the doctrine of the virgin birth. They didn't want anyone reading Luke to get confused and think Joseph was the biological father.
These intentional changes are fascinating because they weren't evil conspiracies. They were overzealous attempts to build a fence around the truth.
That is a good way to put it.
So how does textual criticism act like a physician diagnosing an injury to reverse these well-meaning fixes?
A skilled textual critic looks at the manuscript tradition and applies a basic principle.
Which is?
The harder reading is often the original reading.
Really? The harder reading?
Oh, yes. If a scribe is going to change a text, they will almost always change it to make it easier, smoother, or more orthodox sounding to their own ears. They don't wake up and invent theological difficulties.
Right. That makes sense.
So when the critic sees one manuscript that says Joseph and his mother, and another older manuscript that says his parents, the critic can diagnose the injury.
They know what happened.
Exactly. The critic knows a later scribe altered it to protect the virgin birth. By identifying the motive for the change, the critic can strip away the well-meaning addition and restore the original apostolic wording. The sheer abundance of witnesses that creates these variants also supplies the raw materials for their correction.
Okay, let's step back and look at the big picture here. We have established that the environment was chaotic.
Very.
The scribes had astigmatism, they misheard words, they skipped lines, and they actively tried to fix theological tensions. With all these graphemic errors happening over centuries, how can we trust the text at all?
It is the big question.
To answer that, we have to turn to the words of Christ himself. Let's look at the micropreservation guarantee found in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20.
This passage is the absolute baseline for bibliographic confidence. Jesus is delivering the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
He is outlining the ethics of his kingdom, and right in the middle of it, he makes a staggering cosmic claim about the written text of Scripture. He says, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished."
No.
He explicitly contrasts the physical stability of the universe with the stability of the written word. He is saying the mountains, the oceans, and the stars are less stable than the ink marks of divine revelation.
Let's define those specific Greek and Hebrew words for you, the listener, because he gets incredibly granular here. What is an iota and what is a chariah?
The word iota represents the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet. It corresponds directly to the Hebrew character yod, which is the absolute smallest letter in the Hebrew consonantal script.
Right.
If you look at it on a page, it's basically a tiny apostrophe hanging in the air.
And a karaya.
The word karaya, translated as dot or chital, literally means a little horn. It denotes the microscopic serif, or projection that distinguishes one Hebrew letter from another.
Like a tiny stroke.
Yes. For example, the Hebrew letter dalet and the letter resh look almost identical to the untrained eye. The only difference is a tiny little overhang, a tiny serif, on the top right corner of the dalet.
So Christ is guaranteeing preservation at the most microscopic graphemic level. He is talking about pen strokes.
He is.
It is not just the broad theological concepts that survive. The literal letters are protected through history.
That is the theological force of his statement. He deliberately chose the visual graphemic units of the text itself. He didn't say the broad message of love will survive.
Right.
He didn't say the general themes will survive. He said the smallest pen strokes will survive.
That is amazing.
Yeah. This establishes a structural guarantee of verbal plenary preservation. Scribes may fail, manuscripts may be damaged, and heretics may attempt to excise passages. But the sovereign Lord of history superintends the transmission process to ensure that the exact words of his covenant are never lost to his church.
Why is that level of microscopic precision so critical for Christ specifically? How does a tiny pen stroke tie into his redemptive mission on the cross?
It connects directly to his active and passive obedience.
Break that down for us.
Christ came to fulfill the law perfectly on our behalf. His active obedience involved his sinless life, conforming to every microscopic requirement of the moral and ceremonial law.
Okay.
His passive obedience involved bearing the penal sanctions of the law on the cross. The preservation of the physical, written Old Testament text was a redemptive historical necessity for the validation of his identity as the Messiah.
Because if the specific prophecies, the lineages, or the covenantal details were permanently lost in transmission over the centuries, his messianic credentials couldn't be verified by anyone in the synagogue.
That is precisely the issue. If the prophecy in Micah naming Bethlehem as the birthplace was corrupted by a careless scribe, or if the Davidic genealogy was altered due to scribal fatigue during the Babylonian exile, Jesus couldn't have proven he was the fulfillment of the text.
Right. Yeah, it all falls apart.
The written word is kept pure because it testifies exclusively to the person, the obedience, and the substitutionary death of Jesus Christ. He is the living word who guarantees the permanence of the written word.
If Christ ties his entire redemptive mission to the smallest pen stroke of the text, it completely shatters the modern idea that we can just grasp the general vibe of Jesus and ignore the written word.
Oh, absolutely.
You hear this a lot today. People say, oh, I love the red letters. I love the general message of love and acceptance, but I don't care about the theological minutiae or the strict wording.
Right, very common.
But Jesus himself cared about the minutiae. He tied the existence of the cosmos to a tiny serif on a Hebrew letter.
The general vibe approach is a modern secular philosophy that directly insults the claims of Christ. By placing this micro-preservation guarantee at the very beginning of his ethical discourse on the Mount, Jesus anchors all his subsequent commands in the objective, unchanging authority of the written text.
Wow.
He doesn't allow his hearers to separate his spiritual instructions from the physical words of Scripture.
We have seen Christ's guarantee of the text. Now, how does the Apostle Paul instruct ministers to actually handle these texts in the real world? Let's look at 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 through 17.
This passage gives us the theological framework for how the church receives and utilizes the preserved text. The context is vital here.
Set the scene for us.
Paul is writing this from a cold Roman prison. He is facing his own impending death by execution, and he is warning Timothy about coming apostasy.
Bad times ahead.
Very bad. He says people will be lovers of self, false teachers will creep into households, and deception will multiply. In the face of all this absolute chaos, Paul gives a controlling command to Timothy. He says, "Continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed."
He tells him to abide in the sacred writings. Notice he doesn't tell him to look for a new vision, a fresh revelation, or a new subjective experience to get him through the hard times.
That points to the core difference between liberal theology and historic biblical orthodoxy.
Okay, expand on that.
Liberal approaches treat inspiration as a community's later estimation of religiously powerful documents. They say the community's religious experience validates the text over time.
But Paul says otherwise.
Paul reverses this order entirely. He says the text is profitable because its origin is divine speech. The Greek word he uses is theopneustos, which literally means God-breathed.
God-breathed.
Inspiration identifies the origin of the text, not its effect on the reader. The writings don't just contain good ideas about God, they proceed directly from the mouth of God.
And because they are God-breathed, they have a fourfold utility. Paul says they are profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness.
Yes, teaching supplies the positive content of faith. Reproof uncovers false belief and sinful conduct. It exposes where we are wrong.
Right.
Correction restores the fallen or distorted back to the right path. And training cultivates discipline formation and holiness. The result is that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. This establishes the functional sufficiency of the text. Scripture provides all divine truth necessary for saving faith and faithful obedience.
Wait, I have to jump in here and play devil's advocate for the listener.
Go for it.
Timothy was reading copies of copies. He was in Ephesus reading Greek scrolls. He perhaps even had copies with some of those visual errors we just discussed. The astigmatism errors, the skipped lines, the hearing mistakes.
Very likely, yes.
He didn't have the original autographs signed by Moses or Isaiah sitting on his desk.
No, he didn't.
How does Paul's command to trust the text totally apply to us today, especially when we are reading English translations based on critical editions that have pieced together thousands of fragments?
That is the vital question every Christian has to answer. The functional sufficiency of the text remains intact across the manuscript tradition because the saving message is not suspended upon one single, fragile, disputed variant.
Right.
When Paul told Timothy that the sacred writings were able to make him wise for salvation, he knew Timothy was reading copies. He knew those copies had minor scribal variations.
He wasn't naive about it.
Not at all. Yet the divine breath remains in the text despite the earthen vessels that transmitted it. No central article of the Christian faith hangs upon a disputed reading.
That is so reassuring.
It is. We can trust the text today because the massive redundancy of the manuscript tradition ensures that the truth is preserved. The gospel appears broadly and repeatedly across the canon. Textual criticism doesn't undermine Paul's command, it supports it.
By clearing away the error.
Yes. The critic clarifies the wording of the stable deposit so that the minister can confidently reprove error and train the church in righteousness.
So let's trace how that functional sufficiency actually survived the centuries. How do we get from Timothy's scrolls and those messy medieval copies to the pristine critical editions sitting on our desks today?
It is a great historical arc.
Walk us through the restoration process and the providential tools God used to bring it all together.
The transition from handwritten copies to the printing press completely revolutionized textual transmission. For centuries, manuscripts were copied by hand, and the Byzantine text type became numerically dominant in the Greek East. But in 1516, a massive shift occurred.
The printing press.
Yes. The scholar Erasmus published a printed Greek New Testament.
This was a huge moment in history, but it was also notoriously rushed, wasn't it?
It was famously, recklessly rushed. Erasmus was trying to beat a competing Spanish project, the Complutensian Polyglot, to the market.
A race to the finish line.
Literally. He relied on a very small handful of late medieval manuscripts that he just happened to have access to in Basel, Switzerland. In fact, for the Book of Revelation, he only had one single manuscript, and it was missing the last page.
Missing the last page.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, to finish his edition and meet the printer's deadline, Erasmus literally took the Latin Vulgate and translated the final verses of Revelation backward into Greek.
You are kidding.
No. He created Greek words that had never existed in any Greek manuscript of Revelation.
That is wild. He just reverse-engineered the end of the Bible to beat a competitor to the printing press.
He did. And subsequent editions by scholars like Stephanus and Beza refined Erasmus's work, but they essentially stayed within that same narrow stream of late manuscripts.
Right.
This printed tradition became known as the Textus Receptus, the received text. It had immense historical influence, and it formed the underlying basis for major Reformation-era translations, including the King James Version.
It was incredibly influential, but it wasn't perfect. It was a printed edition based on a handful of late copies, not an untouched manuscript handed down directly from the apostles.
And this is where the tools of modern scholarship enter the picture as instruments of common grace. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars made a deliberate break from exclusive dependence on the Textus Receptus.
Who are these scholars?
Men like Tischendorf, Westcott, and Hort, they began incorporating much older evidence. Tischendorf famously discovered Codex Sinaiticus, an incredibly ancient manuscript, at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula.
A massive discovery.
Huge. They also heavily utilized Codex Vaticanus. Suddenly, scholars had access to papyri and uncials that were copied centuries closer to the time of the apostles than the manuscripts Erasmus used.
So textual critics today have to weigh all of this competing evidence. They look at external evidence and internal evidence to figure out what the original said.
Yes, modern eclectic editions don't just count manuscripts to see which reading has the most votes, they weigh them.
How does that work?
External evidence considers the age of the document and its geographical distribution. If a reading is found in early manuscripts in Egypt, Syria, and Rome simultaneously, it is highly likely to be original because those scribes couldn't have collaborated to make the same mistake.
That makes total sense.
Internal evidence looks at the author's usual vocabulary and style and asks which reading best explains the rise of the other alternatives. The scholars are applying disciplined logic to diagnose those scribal injuries we discussed earlier.
Here is how I like to visualize it for people who get overwhelmed by all the variants. Compare the abundance of manuscripts to a massive jigsaw puzzle.
No way, I like puzzles.
When you buy a puzzle at the store, your biggest fear is that you spend hours finishing it, and you realize you are missing one piece right in the middle.
Oh, that is the worst.
But with the New Testament manuscript tradition, we don't have a puzzle with missing pieces. We have a puzzle where we have 105% of the pieces.
That is a great way to look at it.
Having too many variations isn't a crisis of missing information. It is an abundance of evidence. We just have to sort out the extra 5% of the pieces that don't actually belong to the original picture.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. The variations aren't gaps in the text. They are surplus material caused by scribal overlap, marginal notes being accidentally copied into the main text, and those harmonizations we talked about.
Right.
We have all the pieces. Providence worked through history, providing a multitude of imperfect but mutually correcting witnesses. Restoration is just the act of stewardship, sorting out the surplus so the church can hear the apostolic word clearly.
So bringing all this historical and theological data down to the pew, what does the listener do with this knowledge tomorrow morning when they open their Bible?
The application requires rejecting two extremes. First, we must reject radical skepticism.
Meaning what?
This is the secular idea that variance dissolves certainty, that the Bible is just a playground of errors and we can't know what it originally said. We have seen that this ignores the overwhelming stability, redundancy, and doctrinal coherence of the witnesses.
And the second extreme?
The second extreme we must reject is unhistorical traditionalism.
By that, you mean idolizing one specific translation.
Yes, treating a single translation, like the King James Version, as the ultimate inspired standard, or treating the editorial choices made by a 16th century scholar like Erasmus as if they were breathed out by God.
Right, because Erasmus was rushed.
Exactly. We have to recognize that God preserved his word in the original languages across thousands of manuscripts, not in a single English translation from 1611. We need faithful translation work based on the best critical editions, and we need high-fidelity expository preaching that relies on those original languages.
Let's talk about how pastors should handle this transparently from the pulpit.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you are sitting in church reading your Bible, and you see a footnote at the bottom of the page that says, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include these verses.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
That can be jarring. How should we handle famous disputed passages, like the longer ending of Mark 16, or the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 8?
Pastors must provide guidance on these passages without fear and without hiding the evidence. When preaching Mark 16 or John 8, the minister should state the textual evidence plainly to the congregation.
Just be honest about it.
Yes. Explain that the earliest and most reliable manuscripts lack these sections and that they were likely added by later scribes. Removing a reading judged to be secondary doesn't threaten any core doctrine.
Not at all.
We can read them with total transparency, knowing that the truth of the gospel, the resurrection, and the mercy of Christ are thoroughly established elsewhere in the canon. The better defense of Christ's glory is fidelity to what the evangelists actually wrote, rather than clinging to a pious falsification out of fear.
I think this requires something from you, the listener. It addresses our own spiritual laziness.
That is a hard truth.
You hold an absolute miracle of providence in your hands. This text survived Diocletian's fires. It survived exhausted scribes falling asleep over their parchment in freezing rooms.
Yeah.
It survived the collapse of empires. It demands more from you than a casual glance once a week on Sunday morning. If God moved heaven and earth to preserve the iotas and the charias, we can't treat the Bible like a disposable magazine.
The proper response to providential preservation isn't just winning academic debates about manuscripts. The response is obedience.
Well said.
The passage in 2 Timothy tells us that Scripture equips the man of God for every good work. If we acknowledge the miracle of its transmission, we are obligated to submit to its teaching, to accept its reproof, and to apply its correction to our lives. The restored text must be read, believed, translated, and carried to the nations.
Let's briefly recap the trajectory we have tracked today. We started with the divine breath of inspiration. We saw that flawless composition handed over to fragile human hands, copied in freezing rooms by tired scribes.
Right.
We saw it scattered across the globe by violent persecution, creating a decentralized backup that saved it from total corruption. We heard Christ's absolute guarantee that the smallest pen stroke would survive.
Yes, we did.
And we saw how meticulous providence used the printing press and modern scholarship to restore the text to its pristine state.
It is a sweeping, redemptive historical reality. Human weakness remained real at every step, but the divine purpose prevailed over it all.
Get to.
The Word of God has traveled through fragile hands without ever ceasing to be the voice of the living God.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to think about. Think about the irony of God's method.
What do you mean?
The world expects divine truth to be guarded in an impenetrable vault, untouched by human weakness, kept pristine by angels. Instead, God entrusted his eternal word to the friction to history, to tired eyes, running ink, and fragile papyrus.
That is amazing.
And yet, through that exact frailty, he created a textual record so overwhelmingly resilient that it outlasted the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
It begs the question, if God secures his unbreakable word through the weakest of human vessels, what other fragile areas of your life is he currently using to accomplish his sovereign will? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading the text, and we will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.